communities is having to keep up with something that we don't want to have a part of, and how do we keep a hold of the stuff that is most vital and most important to us while we are thrust into the future. And so to help us think about that, I want you to welcome Mark Baker, opinion leader and commentator. Thank you.
One day, I hope in a long time to come, we're all going to wake up to a headline. After listening to the last talk, I don't know in what form the headline will appear, but the headline will say, "Last Holocaust survivor dies." And the question is, what will we do? So let me start with a story. It's my own personal story. Like many children of Holocaust survivors, I grew up in a household where neither of my parents spoke about what happened to them. What I do remember as a child is how each year my parents would get dressed up in their finest clothes, and they'd say to me that they're going to an event that they called the Buchenwald Ball. At first, I didn't know what they meant. But as an adolescent, I'd learnt about Buchenwald by reading Elie Wiesel's book Night, without knowing that my father had shared that same journey to Buchenwald from Auschwitz. So for years after that, when I watched my parents dressing, I was understandably terrified. Would they return? What did the ball look like? Was the field enveloped in barbed wire? Would their clothes be taken away from them? And my greatest fear was watching them prepare for the ball by showering. Until one year, I think I was about 14 years old, my parents turned to me and said, "No, this year you can come with us." And once inside the Buchenwald Ball Hall, my fears turned to amazement. For the second we walked in, a band struck up and played familiar tunes, Hava Nagila, Tsena Tsena, and these men, about 50 of them, began to dance a horror. And they were sprightly, they were energetic then, and they were joined in the circle by their wives, and then we, the youngsters, were dragged into the circle like it was our bar mitzvah. Only later as an adult, with my own children, did I learn what it means to truly bear witness when I visited one of the few survivors of the Treblinka death camp. I went to his house, he offered me tea and told me, "Wait for me in the living room." I waited and I looked, and the entire room was filled with a table from wall to wall. And I looked at the table and I saw that he had built a train set. How nice, I thought. He's doing this for his grandchildren. And as he came back to the living room with a cup of tea, his hand trembling, I took one more look and I saw that that toy set was surrounded by barbed wire, and that there were little barracks made up of matchsticks and orange cellophane for the fires that stoked the ovens in which the Jewish corpses were burnt after being gassed. Amongst them would have been my grandmother and my two aunties, who my father had never mentioned even existed. So no wonder the survivors didn't speak, but in their silence they carried in their heads, the living room of their souls, the same images that were reconstructed and externalized in that house. But eventually, as we, the children, grew up, we learnt that the silence was a deal the survivors had made with their memories to make space to bring children, we, into this world. I often think of the survivors like the family in Noah's Ark, who after 40 days open the windows, and Noah sends out a dove and then a raven. Why? To see if there's life. And in the case of survivors, if a dove would have been sent out when the windows were open, when the camp gates that said Arbeit macht free were opened wide, the bird, the dove, would have found stacks of corpses, a landscape of biblical proportions made up of death, in which the order of creation had been totally reversed. Against the traditional account of creation, in which we affirm the infinite value and dignity of every single human being, lies a story to which we bear witness in our generation, a story not of creation, but of cremation. You see, one letter separates those two words in English, the letter M. For me, the letter M stands for Mensch. It stands for our humanity. We are the letter that can impact the world to speak out wherever there is injustice. When we see a starving child, when we see a genocide, which takes me back to the Buchenwald Ball. I made a promise that after my parents, who are still both alive, pass on, we, the children, will continue the tradition of celebrating what my father calls his birthday. I'm young, he says. I was born on April 11th, 1945. The last ball I attended was 3 years ago, the 70th anniversary of his liberation. From 50 men, there were about 10, dancing feebly, joined by their families, and a community that had come to dance in the place where the dying once stood. That ball was organized by my late wife, Karen, who 2 weeks after was diagnosed with cancer and died before the next ball. By the time of the ball after that, my brother Johnny had been diagnosed with a similar cancer, and he also died. They were buried on each other's birthdays. Both of them were communally active and exemplified the most profound lesson of my life that I've learned from the survivor generation. There are many ways of fulfilling the commandment to remember, to zachor. But what most survivors chose, not in spite of, but because of their silence, was to dance. In my mother's words, quoting from the Bible, I have put before you the mountain of life and the mountain of death. Now choose. I wouldn't have blamed any of the survivors for choosing death, but instead, they chose life. They danced inside the darkness of their memories they carried so they could give birth to us, literally turn cremation into new acts of creation. They showed gratitude to the organizations in Australia that sponsored their migration, that found them jobs. They raised money for Israel because they knew what it meant to be powerless. They built our community, its schools, its museums, and they laughed inside their tears. And personally, they inspired me to do the same in the face of so much loss and grief. So l'chaim to you all, zachor.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much. In the absence of first-hand survivors, we'll need things to remind us. And you talk elsewhere about ritual and the role of ritual in making sure that we remember. What rituals might play a role in making sure that we never forget?
So you've got to ask everyone here and not me. No, first generation, second generation, third generation. We all share one thing in common. You know, I don't know if there are any Holocaust survivors here. but we've grown up, me from Melbourne, you from Sydney, in communities where the ethos of Holocaust survivors has surrounded us. And we as second, third generation, and now there are great-grandchildren as well, I think need to understand our positioning in history, in Jewish time. It's as if we're sitting at a Seder table commemorating something that happened 2,000 years ago, but we're not. The point is that we are literally the generation in the wilderness that accompanied the Jews who went out of Egypt. And so if we want to remember the Holocaust in the future, and I don't know how long our future is, you're a futurist. You know, Jews are used to talking in terms of 2,000 years' time. Will there be humans? Will there be a planet? In part, our response to the Holocaust, or the legacies of it, I think can help shape what that future might be and whether it will exist. But what's important is to realize that the single most important inheritance we have been given are not the jewels that our parents or grandparents will give us from a bank vault, but it's the legacy of remembering that we are vicarious witnesses to an event. We are the ones walking in the wilderness. And so the greatest challenge of our generation by which we will be judged is whether we find a way of passing on those memories and the stories they've bequeathed to us and into the future. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is by creating a ritual. And in a Jewish ritual, there isn't a stage and an audience, but there's a table, and there's food, and there's a liturgy. The survivors have given us the words to write that liturgy. But it says in the Passover Haggadah that it's not just good enough to tell the story, but it says, V'chol hamarbe lesaper harehu meshubach. What does that mean?
I have no idea.
Whoever expands on the story, whoever adds to the story, is to be praised. And so it's our responsibility to take their words and in the years to come, centuries to come, millennia to come, please God, to create a story. And I pointed at what I think some of the elements of that story are. The counter-revelation of the Holocaust against the dignity of human beings, and to create a grand story that is told at every table, and through that to ensure that the memory is transmitted by expanding on it and shaping it and owning it around our own lives.
Thank you, Mark. The role of ritual in community life is extraordinary. The behavioralist